The city skyline glittered like scattered diamonds across the night, each light a reflection of one man's empire, Elias Grant, the name behind Grant Industries, the empire behind every major construction, hospital, and power plant across 3 continents. His portrait hung in marble lobbies and glass towers, his signature stamped on paychecks that fed tens of thousands of families. Yet at the top of his skyscraper, a penthouse built entirely of glass and silence, Elias sat alone. The room was too large for one man, too quiet for a heart that once burned with ambition. From his window, he could see the world he owned, the shining bridges, the electric trains, the night markets glowing like veins of gold. It should have made him proud. Instead, it made him feel smaller than ever. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at his reflection in the window. His once youthful face had grown harder, colder. Every wrinkle seemed carved by betrayal, every gray hair a memory of trust broken by greed. He had learned to measure loyalty not in words or smiles, but in the silence that followed a paycheck. His phone buzzed. A notification from his assistant flashed across the screen. "Sir, the charity gala team is requesting your presence tonight." He ignored it. He'd been to enough of those, rooms full of laughter without joy, handshakes without honesty. He had become a man celebrated by strangers but unseen by anyone who mattered. Down below, on the 56th floor, the night cleaning staff moved quietly through the corridors. They scrubbed floors, emptied bins, polished surfaces, faces unseen, names unremembered. Elias could see their faint reflections in the elevator glass whenever he descended. He used to greet them years ago, before success taught him the language of distance. He remembered one night, 5 years ago, when his accountant, his most trusted friend, had stolen millions through offshore accounts. Elias had confronted him, eyes burning. "After all I did for you?" Elias had shouted. The man simply shrugged and said, "Everyone has a price, Elias. You just never offered me enough." That line never left him. It haunted him, like a whisper that turned every smile in his company into suspicion. By midnight, Elias found himself walking the empty halls of his corporate headquarters. He often did this when the insomnia struck, wandering through his own empire like a ghost haunting his creation. The walls were lined with glass awards, golden plaques, and framed magazine covers. Fortune's most influential man of the decade. The mind behind modern infrastructure. But the silence mocked him. As he walked, he overheard faint laughter coming from the staff lounge. The janitors were taking their midnight break, unaware that the owner of the building was just beyond the door. He paused, unseen, listening. A man's voice said, "If I were him, I'd retire to an island somewhere. Imagine all that money." Another replied, laughing, "Retire. That man'll die counting zeros." Then came a woman's voice, light, kind, but uncertain. "Money doesn't buy peace, though. My mom says if your soul's empty, your pockets won't fill it." The room went quiet for a moment. Then the first man laughed again. "Tell that to the boss. Bet he hasn't smiled in years." Elias stepped back into the shadows, the laughter echoing like knives. He wasn't angry. He was broken. Because they were right. He took the elevator down to the ground floor. The lobby was empty except for the night guard and a young janitor mopping near the doors. She was humming softly, her reflection rippling on the wet floor. Her name badge caught his eye, Amara L. For a brief second, their eyes met. She smiled, not the kind of smile people gave him out of fear or respect, but something different. Genuine. Warm. "Good night, sir," she said politely, not recognizing him in the dim light. He nodded, almost startled by the simple kindness in her tone. "Why do you work this late?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. She shrugged. "It's quiet at night. I get to think. Besides, someone's got to keep this place clean so it looks perfect in the morning." Her answer lingered. "So it looks perfect in the morning." When he reached the exit, he turned back to look at her once more. She was still humming, still working, no bitterness in her face. For a moment, he envied her peace. That night, Elias didn't drive home. He told his chauffeur to leave him at the city bridge instead. He walked alone, the cold air biting at his face, his coat fluttering in the wind. The streets were quiet except for the hum of passing taxis and the flicker of streetlights. At the center of the bridge, he stopped and looked down at the dark water below. He thought of everything he'd built, the empire, the wealth, the power, and yet, not one person in his company would lift a hand for him if he were on this bridge right now. He remembered the janitor's smile, her kindness. It felt more valuable than every dollar he'd ever made. And suddenly, something clicked inside him, a decision so radical it made his pulse quicken. If money corrupted trust, he'd take money out of the equation. If loyalty couldn't be bought, he would test who truly had it when wealth wasn't in sight. He took out his phone and typed a message to his personal aide. "Effective immediately, I'll be unavailable for 2 weeks. Tell the board I'm on a silent retreat. Do not disclose my location." Then he turned the phone off, slipped it into his pocket, and walked toward the nearest alley. There, under the hum of a flickering street lamp, a beggar sat sleeping with a torn blanket over his shoulders. Elias knelt, studied the man's worn face, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, that will be me." He removed his watch, his wallet, and his tie, placing them beside the sleeping man. The wind rustled through his hair, and for the first time in decades, Elias felt free, free from titles, free from image, free from expectation. As dawn began to rise, he looked at his reflection in a puddle by the curb, no longer the billionaire tycoon, but a nameless soul ready to rediscover what humanity meant. The next morning, the city awoke to the news. Elias Grant missing. Billionaire CEO disappears without a trace. But Elias didn't vanish. He had simply stepped out of his own shadow. And somewhere, deep in his chest, a forgotten part of him whispered, "Let's see who truly deserves everything I've built." Morning came to the city like a sigh, gray, restless, and cold. Commuters flooded Main Street, their faces half hidden behind phones and coffee cups, their pace dictated by deadlines they didn't own. Among the noise and movement, one figure sat still, a man wrapped in layers of worn fabric, his back resting against a marble column outside Grant Industries headquarters. No one looked twice at him. The man's beard was uneven, his shoes mismatched. His eyes, however, were sharp, the eyes of a man who once commanded boardrooms. Elias Grant, the billionaire who vanished without a trace, had returned to the front steps of his own empire, as a beggar. He clutched a tin cup, empty except for 2 dull coins. The cold wind cut through his disguise, but he didn't flinch. Around him, the morning rush blurred into motion, heels clicking, voices overlapping, laughter hollow. Every familiar face walked past him, the same employees who used to nod respectfully when he entered the building. Now they walked around him like he was invisible. A man in a designer coat accidentally kicked his cup, spilling the coins onto the pavement. He muttered a curse, never stopping to help. Another, a woman with a briefcase, wrinkled her nose and stepped over the fallen money. Elias bent down slowly, picking up each coin with trembling fingers. So this is how the world sees the forgotten, he thought. They're not people, they're scenery. By noon, he had memorized the rhythm of indifference. Security guards glanced his way but did nothing. Executives hurried past, some dropping stray coins like offerings to silence their guilt. Elias said nothing, not even, "Thank you." He only watched. Then, sometime past lunch, a faint voice broke the monotony. "You shouldn't sit so close to the wind, sir. You'll catch a cold." He looked up. A young black woman stood before him in a faded blue janitor uniform, a plastic lunchbox in her hands. Her name tag read Amara Lewis. Elias blinked. The same girl from the lobby. "I'm fine," he rasped, disguising his voice. She crouched down anyway and opened her lunchbox. Inside were 2 sandwiches and a small apple, wrapped neatly in foil. "You can take one." "I've got enough," she said with a small smile. He hesitated. "You don't know who I am." "I don't have to," she replied. "You're cold and hungry. That's enough for me." Her words sank deeper than any boardroom praise he'd ever heard. She handed him the sandwich and stood, brushing dust from her knees. Before leaving, she added, "You remind me of my dad. He used to tell me, don't wait to be rich to be kind." When she disappeared into the building, Elias stared at the sandwich like it was made of gold. Days passed. Each morning he took his place on the same corner, and each morning the city proved its blindness anew. People dropped coins without eye contact, as though throwing crumbs to a shadow. Some avoided him entirely. Others joked about him loudly, certain he couldn't hear. But Amara always stopped. Rain or shine, she would greet him softly, share food or conversation. She never asked what happened to him, never pried. Sometimes she'd talk about her mother's illness, the bills piling up, the long hours cleaning offices that never stayed clean. "I work nights because it's quieter," she told him one evening as she left. "And because no one cares who you are at night. You can just be." Elias found himself waiting for her visits. He began to smile again, something he hadn't done in years. Her kindness felt like light sneaking through the cracks of his disguise. One night, long after the building closed, he saw her again. She was leaving late, a mop balanced on her shoulder. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the neon glow of passing taxis. Elias, sitting under an awning, watched as she stopped to cover a sleeping stray dog with her jacket. "Poor thing," she murmured, gently tucking the coat around the animal. Elias's throat tightened. He had built hospitals and donated to charities that bore his name, but he had never given with that kind of tenderness. He suddenly understood why he had never been satisfied with wealth, because wealth had never required empathy. That night, under the hum of the streetlight, he whispered to himself, "She has more riches than I ever did." The next morning brought an unexpected storm. The rain came hard and fast, turning Main Street into a blur of umbrellas. Elias had no shelter. Within minutes he was drenched, his hands shaking from the cold. Still, he stayed, watching, waiting, testing. A few employees hurried past him, muttering complaints about the weather. One tossed him a soaked dollar bill without stopping. Elias's vision blurred from the rain, but then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Sir. Come inside." It was Amara again, holding a small umbrella over his head. She guided him toward the lobby entrance, ignoring the stares of receptionists and guards. "You'll get sick sitting out there," she said, her tone firm but gentle. He looked at her, water dripping from his hair. "Why are you helping me?" "Because someone should," she said simply. "If you wait for the world to be kind, you'll wait forever." For a moment, Elias wanted to tell her everything, who he was, what he was doing, why her kindness mattered more than she could ever imagine. But he stopped himself. The test wasn't over. That evening, as she mopped the floor near the glass doors, he watched her reflection in the window. The city lights shimmered behind her, turning her humble uniform into something almost luminous. The way she carried herself, graceful, uncomplaining, reminded him of everything he'd forgotten about dignity. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a small note he'd written that morning. Tomorrow, the truth begins. Tomorrow, he would leave temptation in plain sight. Tomorrow, he would see who his people truly were. As Amara left the building, she turned back and waved. "See you tomorrow, sir." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Tomorrow," he echoed, though she didn't hear the weight behind the word. When the last of the workers had gone and the city fell into its midnight hush, Elias stood from his spot and looked up at the glowing sign of his own company. Rain dripped from his hair, tracing the lines of a face that had seen too much power and too little grace. He whispered to the night, "Let's see what honesty looks like when no one's watching." The wind carried his words away into the dark. Somewhere, in that same darkness, a janitor with tired hands walked home beneath the rain, unaware that tomorrow, her honesty would change a millionaire's heart forever. The next dawn unfolded with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the city itself held its breath, waiting for a lesson it didn't know was coming. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving the glass facade of Grant Industries gleaming like polished truth. Inside, employees moved briskly through revolving doors, coffee in hand, ambition in their eyes. On the marble floor of the grand lobby, just beyond the security desk, Elias Grant set the stage for his final experiment. Dressed once more as the nameless beggar, he shuffled across the corridor and placed a leather briefcase beside a column, an object too deliberate to be mistaken for trash, too tempting to be ignored. Inside, beneath the smooth lining, rested $50,000 in crisp cash, neatly banded and unmistakably real. Hidden in his coat pocket was a miniature camera, its lens peeking through a buttonhole. The building's internal security feed was also connected, a quiet favor from one loyal engineer who believed his boss was conducting a social behavior test. Elias said nothing more than that. He wanted truth unfiltered, not from reports, not from interviews, but from the raw human moment when no one believed they were being watched. He settled into his familiar post outside the building, the beggar with the quiet eyes and empty cup, and waited. At 8:07 a.m., the first wave arrived. Trevor Malone, mid-level manager with a silver watch and a hollow laugh, was the first to notice the briefcase. He stopped mid-step, pretending to adjust his tie, then glanced left and right. His eyes darted around, landing briefly on the old man by the door. Elias met his gaze. Trevor looked away. He knelt, opened the briefcase slightly, and froze at the sight of money. His hand hovered there, a moral coin toss between greed and conscience. Then he zipped it closed, lifted it discreetly, and walked toward the elevators. 10 seconds later, guilt hesitated long enough for greed to win. He slipped into a side corridor, pulled out a few bundles, and stuffed them into his coat. The rest he left at reception, saying he found it outside. Elias wrote his name down mentally. At 8:19, another employee, Lydia Raines, from HR, spotted it. She gasped softly, knelt down, and looked around nervously. When no one reacted, she murmured, "Probably corporate money, maybe a drop-off." Then she, too, peeked inside. Her hands trembled. A single bill fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, stared at it, the green ink glowing under the morning light, and hesitated. Her lips parted, whispering words meant for herself. No one would miss just one. She slipped it into her purse and walked away. One by one, the test unfolded like a quiet symphony of human weakness. Some ignored the briefcase altogether, afraid of responsibility. Others took glances, left, then returned minutes later pretending to double-check. By noon, the once full case was a shadow of itself, half the money gone, half the truth revealed. And then came Amara Lewis. She entered through the service door, uniform still damp from the morning drizzle. Her step was weary, her hands red from chemical cleaning. She was halfway to the janitor's closet when she noticed it, the brown leather glinting near the lobby pillar. For a moment she thought someone had forgotten it. Then she saw the gold clasp, slightly open, revealing a sliver of cash. Her brow furrowed. She looked around, the guards chatting near the gate, the executives bustling past with their lattes, the beggar outside watching quietly. Something in her heart whispered, "This isn't right." She approached it slowly, lifted the handle, and sighed. "Someone's going to panic when they realize this is missing," she murmured. The security guard noticed her and frowned. "Hey, miss, what's that you got there?" "It was on the floor," she said. "Looks expensive." He shrugged. "Not my problem. Lost and found's closed till evening." Amara looked uneasy. "Then I'll hold it at the desk until someone asks for it." "Suit yourself." She nodded, carried it gently to the counter, and placed it on the marble. She didn't open it, didn't peek again, didn't even count the temptation inside. Instead, she scribbled a note on a yellow sticky pad. "Found outside near main door. Please announce in the morning briefing." Her handwriting was small, careful. She signed it A. Lewis. Before leaving, she paused for one more look. The sunlight had shifted, catching the edges of the case, making it glow faintly, like the universe itself was marking the moment. Outside, Elias's throat tightened. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had seen everything, through the window reflection, through the faint echo of her voice. He didn't feel relief. He felt humbled. There she was, a woman who earned barely enough to afford bus fare, who could have ended her struggles in an instant, and yet walked away with lighter hands and a heavier soul full of peace. He closed his eyes and whispered, "So that's what integrity looks like when it costs something." Hours later, when the building emptied for the day, Elias walked inside. No one recognized him under the beard and grime. The lobby lights were dimmed, and the hum of vacuums filled the corridors. He went straight to the reception desk, the briefcase still there, untouched since Amara had placed it. The yellow note was still pinned to it, neat and proud. Elias picked it up, reading her name over and over. The words blurred as tears stung his eyes. He sat down on a lobby bench, the same marble he'd designed years ago to impress clients, and felt the weight of something far purer than wealth pressing against his heart. He opened the case, untouched since her hands left it. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a single gold pen, his own, engraved with the initials E.G. He clicked it open and wrote on the same sticky note beneath her words. "Integrity doesn't wait to be rewarded, it rewards itself. E.G." Then he closed the case again. The next morning, when Amara arrived for her shift, she found the briefcase gone, and in its place, an envelope addressed to her. Inside was a short note and a gold access card with her name printed in embossed letters. The note read, "Report to the top floor at noon. The owner." She frowned, confused. The top floor. No janitor had ever been invited there. Outside, across the street, Elias watched from beneath his hood as she held the letter close, her eyes widening with uncertainty. He smiled faintly, not the polished grin of a man who just orchestrated a lesson, but the quiet, reverent smile of someone who had finally been taught one. Morning light spilled across the upper floors of Grant Industries like a quiet confession. The vast glass windows glimmered, reflecting a city that had no idea its most powerful man was about to return, not as a CEO, but as a man reborn. Elias Grant stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse suite, shaving away the weeks of disguise. The reflection that stared back at him looked unfamiliar at first, older, wiser, stripped of arrogance. Gone was the untouchable mogul who spoke in numbers and forecasts. What remained was someone humbled by the simplicity of a sandwich shared, and the sight of a janitor choosing honesty over survival. He tightened his tie slowly, his movements deliberate. Every fabric choice, every cufflink, every breath seemed symbolic, an armor being reforged not for war, but for truth. He whispered to his reflection, "Let's see who stands tall when the masks come off." By noon, the grand conference room on the 70th floor was full. The top executives of Grant Industries had gathered in confusion and quiet panic. Rumors had already spread through the company that Elias was alive, that he was coming in person to address them. Some hoped for mercy, others prepared excuses. At precisely 12 o'clock, the doors opened. Elias entered. A hush swept the room. He wasn't flanked by guards or assistants. He walked alone, every step echoing across the marble. His presence carried a calm gravity that silenced even the most arrogant voices. He stopped at the head of the long table and looked at the faces before him, men and women who had once hung on his every word, now avoiding his gaze. He placed a black tablet on the table, its screen glowing faintly. "I've spent the last few weeks learning what my wealth has hidden from me," he began, his voice steady but low. "And today, I intend to show all of you what I found." The room stirred uncomfortably. Elias tapped the tablet. The lights dimmed. A video began to play on the massive digital wall behind him. The footage was grainy but clear enough, a leather briefcase, the Grant Industries lobby, and the silent test that had unfolded there. Gasps rippled through the room as each familiar face appeared on screen. Executives, managers, even team leads, caught stealing, hesitating, or walking away. Some covered their faces, others muttered denials. One man stood abruptly, his voice shaking. "This is invasion of privacy. You had no right." Elias cut him off with a look sharp enough to freeze him mid-sentence. "No right?" he repeated quietly. "You stole money from the floor of this building. You turned your eyes away from honesty and called it convenience. You did this when you believed no one was watching. Tell me, Mr. Malone, if you'll cheat a stranger, what would you do to a shareholder?" Trevor Malone sank back into his chair, pale and speechless. The footage continued. Elias's tone grew heavier, yet calmer, as if disappointment hurt more than anger ever could. "Money," he said softly, "reveals who we really are. It exposes our character more than it ever measures success." He turned back toward the screen. The next clip appeared. This one was different. Amara Lewis entered the frame. Her uniform was damp from the rain. She hesitated near the briefcase, her brow furrowed. Then, slowly, she picked it up. "Watch closely," Elias murmured. Everyone leaned forward. The clip showed her carrying it to the desk, leaving a note, refusing to open it. The guard ignored her. She persisted. The moment felt almost sacred, like witnessing light in the middle of darkness. When the clip ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Elias turned back to the table, his voice firm but calm. This is what integrity looks like." He gestured toward the image of Amara frozen on the screen, her humble figure framed by sunlight spilling through the lobby doors. "She earns less in a month than some of you spend on a weekend dinner." Yet when temptation lay before her, she didn't hesitate. She didn't take. She didn't hide. She chose right, because that's who she is, not because anyone was watching. His words sank deep. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint tap of a nervous pen against the table, the slow collapse of pride. A woman from HR spoke up weakly. "Sir, she's a janitor." Surely she didn't realize how much money was inside. Elias turned to her sharply. "That's exactly the point. She didn't need to know the amount to know it wasn't hers." He walked toward the window, gazing out at the skyline he had once thought was his greatest achievement. "I built this company with the belief that success was about control of people, markets, outcomes. But Amara reminded me that success means nothing without conscience. And I will not lead an empire built on cowardice disguised as ambition." He turned back, eyes burning with resolve. "Effective immediately, those who failed this test will be reviewed for ethics violations. You will have one chance to make amends, not excuses. But understand this, your future here depends not on skill, but on honesty." A murmur spread across the room, fear, guilt, realization. Then Elias pressed another button. The screen behind him changed again. It showed Amara Lewis standing in the lobby that morning, reading a letter with her name on it. The envelope fluttered slightly in her hands as she whispered the words to herself, "Report to the top floor at noon." Elias turned to the elevator doors just as they opened. And there she was. Amara stepped inside the boardroom hesitantly, holding the letter. Her eyes widened at the sight of the powerful men and women seated before her. Then she saw Elias, the beggar from the street, now standing tall in a tailored suit. She gasped softly. "You," she whispered. "You're." "Yes," he said gently, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "I'm Elias Grant. And you are the reason I came back." The room turned their gaze toward her, a mixture of guilt and admiration in their eyes. She looked confused, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Elias walked over and placed a hand on the table beside her. "When everyone else saw money, you saw responsibility. When others looked away, you stepped forward. You didn't just return a briefcase, you returned something I had lost long ago, faith and decency." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same yellow note she'd written. The ink was slightly faded, her handwriting small but steady. "You wrote this when you thought no one would ever see it. And yet, it changed everything." Tears welled in her eyes. "I just did what anyone should have done." He smiled faintly. "If that were true, this company wouldn't need a lesson." He turned to the board. "From this day, Amara Lewis is no longer part of the janitorial staff. She will serve as the ethics officer of Grant Industries, reporting directly to me." Gasps filled the room. One executive stood to protest, but Elias raised a hand. "The discussion is over. Her honesty will do more for this company than a dozen degrees ever could." Amara's hands trembled as he handed her a small gold badge engraved with her new title. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing," he replied gently. "Just keep being who you already are." When she left the room moments later, the hall erupted with whispered disbelief. But Elias didn't hear them. He stood quietly at the window, watching her disappear into the elevator, a small smile softening his face. He had seen his empire at its worst and found its salvation in the most unlikely soul. As the sunlight glowed against the tower's glass, Elias whispered to himself, "A janitor taught a millionaire how to be human again." And for the first time in decades, that lesson felt richer than all the gold in his vault. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows of Elias Grant's office like forgiveness made visible. The skyline of the city shimmered beyond the glass walls, alive with motion and purpose. But inside, there was a rare silence, the kind that arrives after a storm of realization. Elias sat at his desk, an untouched cup of coffee beside him, staring at the nameplate that had once defined him, Elias Grant, Chief Executive Officer. It used to symbolize victory. Now, it felt like responsibility. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. Amara Lewis stepped inside. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a modest gray suit that fit awkwardly, as if she still couldn't believe she belonged in it. Her ID badge gleamed with new lettering, Amara Lewis, Corporate Ethics Officer. She looked nervous, hands clasped, eyes lowered. "Sir, I wanted to thank you. For yesterday. For everything." Elias rose from his chair. "Don't thank me, Amara. You earned it." She shook her head slightly. "No, sir. I didn't do anything special. I just did what my mother taught me, to leave things better than I found them." He smiled faintly. "That's rarer than you think." He gestured for her to sit. The office was still intimidating, a world away from the janitor's closet she'd spent years in. She hesitated before sitting, her back straight, her palms folded tightly in her lap. Elias studied her for a moment, the calm humility, the quiet confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than pride. "Do you know why I called you up here today?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, sir." He turned his laptop toward her. On the screen was a document labeled Grant Industries Employee Restructure Initiative. Beneath it was a line in bold, "New Department, Integrity and Human Values." "I want you to run this," Elias said simply. "Your job is to ensure that every person in this company, from the boardroom to the cleaning crew, is treated with dignity. You'll oversee employee ethics, welfare, and fairness. No more invisible people." Amara's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm not qualified for something like that." Elias smiled softly. "That's exactly why you are. You don't see people as ranks or salaries. You see them as human beings. That's what this company forgot, and what you reminded me of." She blinked rapidly, fighting back emotion. "Sir, I don't even have a degree. I don't know if I could do what you're asking." "Then we'll teach you," Elias said. "I'll have you mentored. You'll study management, leadership, communication, but don't mistake education for wisdom. You already have what most of us lost." Later that afternoon, Elias gathered the entire staff in the auditorium, hundreds of employees filling the seats, murmuring, curious. For the first time in company history, the CEO himself stood at the podium without a script, without slides, without ego. He spoke with a rawness that caught everyone off guard. Many of you have heard the rumors, he began. That I went missing. That I lost my mind. Maybe I did, because for years, I thought wealth made me wise. But it doesn't. It makes you deaf if you're not careful. The room was silent. I saw things, he continued. I saw how we treat those who have less. I saw how easily we turn away when kindness costs us time. I saw my own reflection in your greed and my redemption in someone who cleans our floors. He turned slightly and gestured to the side of the stage. I'd like you all to meet your new ethics officer, Amara Lewis. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The janitor. The quiet girl who mopped the hallways. She stepped onto the stage, her nerves trembling beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes. She doesn't come from wealth, Elias said. She doesn't hold an MBA. But she holds something infinitely more powerful, integrity. And starting today, this company answers to her when it comes to moral conduct. Amara approached the microphone, hesitant. For a moment, her voice caught in her throat. But when she spoke, her words were steady, gentle, and true. I don't know how to lead a company, she said softly. But I do know how to treat people right. If you see someone struggling, help them. If you make a mistake, admit it. And if you ever think no one's watching, remember, you are. A long silence followed, not awkward, but reverent. Then, one by one, the audience rose to their feet. The sound of applause filled the hall, echoing off marble and glass. Elias clapped, too, not as a CEO, but as a student humbled by his teacher. In the weeks that followed, the culture at Grant Industries began to shift. For the first time, the janitorial staff ate lunch in the same cafeteria as executives. Pay disparities began to shrink. An employee fund was established for health emergencies. Amara's small department grew, not because of power, but because of trust. Elias found himself spending more time walking the lower floors, speaking to employees he'd once passed without seeing. He began greeting the night crew by name. He replaced polished marble plaques with a new inscription that read, "Integrity is doing right when no one's looking." Sometimes, he'd find Amara sitting in the courtyard during her breaks, helping new interns study or sharing advice with cleaners. Her influence spread quietly, like sunlight reaching into forgotten corners. One evening, Elias found her alone in the lobby, mopping the floor herself. He smiled, amused. "You have a team for that now, you know." She looked up and laughed softly. "I know. But I like the feeling of doing something with my own hands. It reminds me where I came from." He nodded, deeply moved. "And it reminds me where I lost my way." There was a long, comfortable silence between them. Then Elias said, "Do you know what my mother used to tell me?" Amara shook her head. She said, "Son, you can build towers that touch the sky, but if you forget the people holding the bricks, they'll bury you under them." Amara smiled. "Sounds like something my mom would have said, too." They stood there for a moment, two souls from different worlds, bound by the same truth. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Amara's desk. It bore no signature, only a golden seal of the company. Inside was a handwritten note in Elias's script. "To the woman who reminded me what leadership means. Your salary is now equal to your value, which is beyond measure. Use it to help others rise with you. E.g." Beneath the note was a check that could have paid her mother's medical bills 10 times over. She cried quietly at her desk, not out of greed, but gratitude, not for the money, but for the acknowledgement that dignity had finally been seen. That night, Elias looked out from his penthouse once more. The city lights blinked like 1,000 second chances. Somewhere below, he could see the faint glow of Amara's new office window, small, humble, but bright. He smiled and whispered, "The company's richest woman isn't me anymore." And for the first time in his life, Elias Grant slept with peace instead of pride. 6 months later, Grant Industries no longer felt like the empire it once was, it felt alive. The walls that had once whispered greed and hierarchy now hummed with a softer sound, conversation, collaboration, and laughter. The change began subtly, like spring seeping into the cracks of winter. Amara Lewis's office, once tucked beside the janitorial storage room, now sat near the executive wing, a modest glass room with no walls of separation, only a handwritten sign that read, "Open door equals open heart." Employees soon learned she meant it literally. She spoke with the interns who were too nervous to ask questions, the guards who'd worked 12-hour shifts, the secretaries who knew the company's soul better than any report. Elias watched quietly from a distance, humbled by the simplicity of her influence. One morning, she arrived early, as always, and found a small group of maintenance workers arguing near the freight elevator. Their pay dispute had been buried in HR paperwork for months. Instead of forwarding an email or quoting policy, Amara listened. She took notes, made a few calls, and by lunchtime, the back pay was processed. "Thank you, ma'am," one of them said, eyes glistening. She smiled. "Don't thank me. Just do your work with pride. That's how you pay it forward." Word spread like wildfire. People began approaching her not just for problems, but for guidance. She didn't manage through authority, she led through empathy. When she walked through the lobby, employees straightened a little taller. The janitors who had once been invisible were now greeted by name. Even executives began holding meetings on the ground floor, mingling with departments they'd never visited before. Elias Grant watched the shift unfold from his glass-walled office. But this time, he didn't isolate himself. He often joined the staff in the cafeteria, trading stories, laughing at jokes that once would have seemed beneath him. One afternoon, Amara walked in to find him sitting with a group of young interns, sleeves rolled up, eating boxed sandwiches. "Sir, you're causing chaos," she teased. He chuckled. "I figured it was time to start from the ground floor again." They shared a smile, the kind that comes from shared understanding rather than status. Elias had changed in other ways, too. He'd given up his penthouse office, converting it into a rooftop learning center for employees and their families. Twice a week, he hosted open lectures on leadership and humility, quoting Amara more often than any textbook. At the quarterly shareholder meeting, investors expected charts, projections, and profit forecasts. Instead, Elias walked on stage with a photograph of the company's cleaning crew projected behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "these are the people who hold up this building. And as of this quarter, they'll share in our profits. Because an empire is only as clean as the hands that build it." Some investors murmured disapproval. One stood up, frowning. "You'll lose millions doing this." Elias met his gaze calmly. "I've lost more from arrogance." He turned to the audience. "If you're investing in me for greed, sell your shares. If you're investing in me for growth, real growth, stay. The future doesn't belong to the richest company, it belongs to the most human one." The room fell silent. Then a slow clap began. It grew into a standing ovation. Amara, watching from backstage, felt tears rise. The transformation rippled beyond the company walls. News outlets picked up the story. Billionaire rebuilds his empire on integrity. Universities called to study the grant model of ethics-based management. Other corporations began adopting similar programs. But for Elias and Amara, fame wasn't the point. They measured success in smaller miracles, in the cafeteria worker who went back to college with the company's help, in the single mother promoted from cleaning supervisor to logistics coordinator, in the quiet pride that replaced resentment in the eyes of every employee. One evening, as dusk painted the skyline gold, Elias visited Amara in her office. She was surrounded by papers, handwritten letters from employees thanking her for listening, for caring. "You've done more for this place in half a year than I managed in 30, Elias said softly. Amara looked up, modest as ever. "You gave me the chance. That's more than most people ever get." He shook his head. "I gave you a title. You gave this place a soul." They stood in silence for a while, the city lights flickering below like stars trying to speak. A week later, an unexpected test came. A regional branch manager was caught embezzling funds. The old Elias might have handled it quietly, burying the scandal to protect the brand. But this time, he called an open meeting. The employees gathered in the main hall as Elias and Amara took the stage. "This isn't about shame," Amara began, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. When we say integrity, we don't just mean when things are easy. We mean especially when they're hard." Elias added, "The world will always test our morals. Today, we decide if Grant Industries is a brand or a belief." They implemented a transparent review system, led not by punishment but by rehabilitation, a chance for those who falter to rebuild trust through service and training. Instead of firing the guilty manager, they reassigned him to community work, under Amara's mentorship. Months later, he'd become one of her staunchest supporters. The company's transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Elias spent his evenings visiting schools the company funded, meeting students who dreamed of futures his scholarships now made possible. He spoke of failure, not as shame, but as a teacher. Success without empathy is poverty of the soul, he told them. And the poorest man is the one who forgets gratitude. One evening, Amara invited him to her home. It was a small apartment on the city's south side, where her mother, now recovering from illness, sat knitting on the couch. "So you're the man who made my daughter boss," the older woman said with a smile. Elias laughed warmly. "She made herself boss, ma'am. I just got out of her way." They shared dinner, rice, stew, and laughter that felt more nourishing than any banquet Elias had ever attended. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a leader at the head of a table, he felt like family. As he left that night, Amara's mother pressed his hand. "Thank you for seeing what the world overlooks," she said. Elias drove home through the sleeping city, his heart full. Months turned into a year. The ethics and humanity division became the beating heart of the company. Amara spoke at conferences, not as a corporate figure, but as a voice of working-class dignity. During an interview, a reporter asked her, "Do you ever think about the day you found that briefcase?" She smiled softly. "Every day. Not because it changed my life, but because it changed his." The camera panned to Elias watching from the audience, eyes shining with quiet pride. On the anniversary of the company's founding, a ceremony was held in the lobby. The golden letters of Grant Industries now had a new inscription beneath them. Built by hands, led by hearts. Elias and Amara stood side by side as employees from every department filled the hall. He turned to her, his voice low. "You taught me that leadership isn't about being followed. It's about walking beside. She smiled. And you taught me that power isn't evil, it's what you do with it that defines you. The crowd applauded as they unveiled the new plaque together, the sound echoing through the glass tower like a promise kept. For Elias Grant, transformation had never been about status, it was about purpose. And for everyone who worked beneath the shining windows of Grant Industries, it was proof that honesty could not only feed the soul, it could rebuild the world. The air in the auditorium shimmered with anticipation. It was the 50th anniversary of Grant Industries, and every seat was filled, from interns to senior partners, from board members to the janitorial crew who once worked unseen in the shadows. Cameras lined the back walls, news outlets whispered about a major announcement, and the city's skyline outside flickered like an audience of stars waiting for the curtain to rise. On stage stood a single podium, adorned with nothing more than the company's new motto carved in brushed steel. Built by hands, led by hearts. Elias Grant waited backstage, calm but contemplative. His once black hair was now silver at the temples, his eyes gentler than they'd been in decades. The years had carved wisdom into his face, not from wealth, but from humility learned the hard way. He straightened his tie and glanced toward Amara, standing a few feet away, her notes trembling slightly in her hands. She still looked uncomfortable in the spotlight, though she had become a quiet legend in the business world, the janitor turned ethics officer whose heart had rewritten the soul of an empire. "You ready?" Elias asked softly. She exhaled, smiled faintly. "Not really." "Good," he said, chuckling. "Neither am I." The stage lights brightened. A voice over the intercom echoed through the hall. "Please welcome Mr. Elias Grant." The applause was thunderous as Elias stepped into view. He paused at the center of the stage, letting his gaze wander across the sea of faces, not of employees, but of people who had become a family. 50 years, he began, his voice calm but resonant. Half a century of bricks, blueprints, and ambition. When I founded Grant Industries, I thought success meant building higher than everyone else. But I was wrong. True success isn't about how tall we build, it's about how deeply we care. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of cameras. He continued, his tone softening. "A few years ago, I disguised myself as a beggar to test the integrity of this company. Many failed. But one person saw what others ignored, not a man in rags, but a human being. That moment changed everything." He gestured toward the wings. "And today, I'd like to introduce you to the person who changed my life, Ms. Amara Lewis." The crowd erupted. Amara stepped into the light, hesitant at first, then standing tall as applause thundered around her. Employees who once passed her in silence now stood to honor her. The camera flashes painted her in halos of light, but her expression remained humble, almost shy. Elias offered her the podium, whispering, "It's your company as much as mine now." She took a breath and began, her voice trembling but sincere. "When I started here, I never imagined this," she said. "I used to clean these halls. I thought people like me were invisible. But one act of honesty changed everything, not just for me, but for what this company stands for." She glanced at Elias, her eyes soft. "Mr. Grant taught me that power can corrupt, but it can also transform. That leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about giving others a reason to believe in goodness again." Applause filled the hall again, but Elias raised his hand gently, signaling quiet. He stepped forward, taking the microphone once more. "Amara, when you returned that briefcase years ago, you didn't just return money. You returned my faith in people. You reminded me that dignity doesn't come from wealth, it comes from doing what's right when no one's watching. He turned to the audience. That's why I'm here today, not to celebrate the past, but to ensure the future has the right hands to hold it. The room stilled. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, gold-trimmed with the company crest. Inside this, he said, holding it up, is the legal transfer of my position as Chief Executive Officer of Grant Industries. A murmur rippled through the audience. Shock. Awe. He turned toward Amara, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. As of this day, I am stepping down, and naming you, Amara Lewis, as the new CEO. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Then a gasp rose from the crowd, followed by applause that shook the walls. Amara froze, eyes wide, lips parted. Sir. I can't, I'm not. Elias smiled, eyes kind but resolute. You said that once before, remember? When I asked you to run the ethics department. And yet here we are. Tears welled in her eyes. But this is your company. He shook his head. No. This was my company. Now it's our legacy. He placed the envelope in her trembling hands. You've built something greater than I ever did, trust. You gave people hope. You reminded them that honesty can win in a world that rewards shortcuts. Amara covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. The audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, chanting her name. Speech, someone called from the back. She shook her head, overwhelmed, but Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Go on, he whispered. Say what you always say. She turned back to the crowd, the lights bright, her vision blurred by emotion. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she began, voice cracking. But I do know what I believe. She took a deep breath, then continued, her tone stronger. I believe a company should never forget the people who sweep its floors or polish its windows. I believe a name means nothing if it doesn't stand for kindness. And I believe leadership isn't about being perfect, it's about being accountable, compassionate, and human. She paused, glancing at Elias. I once thought people like me didn't belong up here. But today, I realize, this isn't about where you start. It's about what you stand for. The room erupted again. Even seasoned executives were crying. Elias stepped beside her once more, his expression peaceful. There's one last thing I'd like to do before I go, he said. He turned toward the massive company banner hanging behind the stage, Grant Industries emblazoned in gold. Slowly, he walked up to it and pulled down a smaller, hidden panel beneath. The new name shimmered beneath the lights. Lewis Grant Foundation. Where integrity builds the future. Gasps filled the hall, followed by a roar of applause so powerful it seemed to vibrate the very air. Amara's knees weakened, but Elias caught her arm gently, steadying her. He smiled warmly. The world needs builders of character, not just builders of wealth. You, Amara, are both. After the ceremony, when the cameras faded and the crowd dispersed, the two stood together on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. The evening sun cast long shadows across the skyline, painting the glass towers in gold. Amara looked out in silence, her voice barely a whisper. Why me, Mr. Grant? He turned toward her. Because when everyone else reached for money, you reached for meaning. She smiled faintly. And what will you do now? He chuckled softly. Live. Maybe start a school. Teach what you taught me. They stood there for a while, the wind brushing against their faces. Then Elias said quietly, "You know, Amara, I used to believe legacy was about names carved in stone. But it's not. It's about hearts changed for the better." She looked at him, eyes bright with gratitude. "Then I guess we both built one." He nodded, eyes misting. "Yes. Together." Below them, the city pulsed with light, a city no longer ruled by power, but guided by honesty. And as night fell over the glowing letters of Lewis Grant Foundation, the world had already begun to feel the ripple of one beggar's test, one janitor's honesty, and one man's redemption. A decade had passed since the day Elias Grant handed over his company to a woman who once mopped its floors. 10 years since a janitor's honesty rewrote the story of one of the world's largest corporations, and, in many ways, the story of humanity itself. The Lewis Grant Foundation Tower stood now as both symbol and sanctuary. The golden logo no longer represented profit, it represented principle. The lobby that once echoed with hurried footsteps and hushed ambition now welcomed children from underprivileged schools, innovators from forgotten neighborhoods, and dreamers who had once been told they'd never belong. Every Monday morning, Amara Lewis walked through those same glass doors, carrying the same small smile she always had, the one that said, "I still remember where I came from." She wore no jewelry, no extravagance, just a silver pin shaped like a heart and a hand, the foundation's emblem. Her office overlooked the same skyline where Elias once searched for meaning among the lights. But where he once saw distance, she saw connection. To her, every window reflected a person whose life had been touched by the company's transformation. That morning, she was meeting with a group of scholarship students. They were from different corners of the world, one from Lagos, another from Karachi, another from Detroit. They'd all been funded through the foundation's Work with Dignity initiative, a program born from Amara's vision to make education and ethics inseparable. "Do you know what this place was before?" she asked them softly. The youngest student, a girl no older than 15, raised her hand shyly. "A business company?" Amara smiled. "Yes. A business. But business without heart can destroy just as much as it builds. A wise man once told me, wealth can buy loyalty, but only respect can build legacy. That's what we're here to protect." She watched their faces, bright, curious, unspoiled. Each one reminded her of herself, once unseen, sweeping marble floors and wondering if goodness could survive in a world obsessed with power. Later that day, she visited the rooftop garden, once Elias's private retreat, now a public memorial named the Terrace of Truth. The air smelled of jasmine and old rain. There, surrounded by benches engraved with stories of ordinary workers who had changed lives, stood a bronze statue of Elias Grant. He wasn't immortalized in his CEO suit. Instead, the sculpture showed him in his later years, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, smiling beside a young woman holding a mop handle that rose like a flag. Beneath them, words carved in stone read, "Integrity doesn't ask for witnesses, it creates them." Amara paused, her hand brushing over the letters. "You'd hate this statue," she whispered with a smile. "Too sentimental." A voice from behind her made her turn. "He'd pretend to hate it," said Michael Grant, Elias's grandson, now a teacher in the Foundation's Ethics Academy. "But secretly, he'd be proud." Amara laughed softly. "He was always too proud to admit sentiment." Michael joined her by the statue, the evening light framing both their silhouettes. "Grandfather used to tell me about that day," he said. "When you found the briefcase. Said it was the moment he saw God in an ordinary act." Amara looked out at the horizon. "It wasn't about God. It was about choice. Every day gives us one, to do right quietly or wrong conveniently. Michael smiled. You know, kids in my class quote you more than him now. She laughed gently. Then the world's finally healing. That evening, a ceremony was held in the Foundation's main hall, the 10th anniversary gala. But unlike corporate banquets of old, there were no luxury chandeliers or overpriced plates. The hall was filled with warmth, string lights, wooden tables, simple food, and music performed by children from the Foundation's programs. At the center of the stage sat an empty chair draped in a deep blue scarf, Elias's. Every year, they left it open, not as mourning, but as remembrance that leadership never truly dies, it passes on. Amara took the stage as the hall quieted. Her voice, aged slightly by time but still strong with conviction, carried across the crowd. 10 years ago, she began, a man who had everything decided to give something no one expected, his faith. He believed the world could change if we stopped measuring worth in dollars and started measuring it in dignity. She glanced toward the empty chair. He once said legacy isn't what we leave behind, but who we lift as we go. And tonight, I see that legacy alive in every face before me. The audience, hundreds of employees, scholars, and families, leaned in, captivated. When I took over this foundation, people asked me how a janitor could lead a corporation. My answer has never changed. A janitor already leads, she just does it with a broom instead of a title. Leadership isn't position, it's perspective. It's doing right even when the world looks away. Applause swelled, quiet at first, then rising into thunder. After the ceremony, Amara stepped outside to the terrace once more. The night was alive with city light, but the stars still shone through. She could almost feel Elias there beside her, not as a ghost, but as presence, the way kindness lingers long after its author is gone. She closed her eyes and remembered his last day alive, years earlier, sitting on this same terrace. He had been ill, frail, but his spirit unshaken. You know what I realized, Amara, he'd said, watching the sunset. What? She'd asked. That you don't find peace by forgiving others, you find it by forgiving yourself for who you were before you learned better. Those were the last words he ever said to her. Now, standing beneath that same orange horizon, she smiled through tears. You forgave yourself, Elias, she whispered. And because of that, the rest of us could learn how to. A sudden breeze brushed through the garden, scattering petals across the ground. One landed near her shoe, a white jasmine bloom. She bent to pick it up, turning it between her fingers, then placed it gently at the base of the statue. Behind her, the sound of laughter and music rose from the hall, the living proof of their shared legacy. She whispered to the night, "This is your world now, Elias. The one you hoped for." The following morning, newspapers around the globe carried a photograph from the gala, Amara Lewis standing beneath the glowing sign of the Lewis Grant Foundation, 1,000 smiling employees behind her, and a caption that read, "From janitor to visionary, the woman who redefined success." But Amara didn't keep the paper. She left it on a cafe counter downtown, where a young cleaner on his lunch break picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, and smiled. Maybe, he thought, the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. Maybe goodness still had a chance. He folded the paper neatly, slipped it into his pocket, and went back to work, humming a tune under his breath. And as sunlight spilled across the city, its reflection danced across the letters on the foundation's tower, the same words that had once changed a billionaire and built a better world. Integrity is doing right when no one's watching.